All right. I am here with Dr. Kuba from This is Revolution, Foreign Policy Crew. We were also supposed to have Djene Bajalan, but a family situation came up and he could not make it. But we are here. I've been looking forward to this. I don't remember who first pointed out to me that this debate existed, but I think it's one of those things that the more you think about it, the stranger it is that it exists. Like, this is a debate at the Oxford Union between E.P. Thompson, who's one of the most important British Marxist historians, and Casper Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense. That's just a weird thing to have happen. It's very hard to imagine that happening in 2021.
And just the terms of the debate, that you could have these big global security issues on the table and have an audience comprised of Oxford students in the UK that would entertain both views. It feels like we're a long way from there. Can you imagine the reaction from the American students if Donald Rumsfeld or Condoleezza Rice were speaking at an American campus, even if it were to debate Marxists, anti-war intellectual? And similarly, the right would go nuts with critical race theory, style hysteria. And it wouldn't even matter. No. This is just a Marxist. It's a straight up Marxist, not a CRT generation.
Well, I mean, a big part of the case against CRT, not the Marxist case against CRT, for which I'm much more sympathetic, but like a big part of the right wing's case against CRT is that they think that it's Marxist because they don't make those distinctions.
Marxism just means something that the right doesn't like.
More or less, yeah.
I'm waiting for Islamo-Marxism to be a thing, but like the whole war on terror is really, early 2000s.
I'm actually surprised it wasn't a thing at the time.
Yeah, and I think it was mostly because Al Qaeda was like, no thanks.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in that case it's just like a little bit too obvious that their various enemies couldn't be conflated with each other. That it's like, okay, people kind of know that the Taliban had a history with communists that was not positive, and even if you didn't know that, like, you might vaguely sense that like the left likes gender equality, and there's some tension points there. But honestly, in retrospect, it still seems like something that would have happened, that they would have tried to conflate those two things.
Well, you see there's this kind of LGBT rainbow flags for Palestine activist movement, which would be perfect red meat, right? That would be the way that you could say, there we go, Islamo-Marxism. But that happened kind of too late. And it's an interesting case of the American internal political divisions feeding into foreign affairs rather than something actually driven by the international security situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
right.
The current moment is doing interesting things for America's relationship, the attitude of American conservatives with Russia, and more interestingly, China, because you can kind of understand why some cultural conservatives would like Putin, right? He's masculine. He has no sympathies for LGBTQ.
Orthodox Church.
Exactly. He's sort of an Orthodox revivalist. What's more interesting is that you get conservative Christians that see that Xi Jinping moves against like, sissy actors and K-pop fandom and even the video game restrictions for minors. And they think to themselves like, yeah, actually, here's a good Christian leader. This is what leadership should be. And the actual Marxist, the actual, communist ends up being more palatable than Western Marxism.
Yeah, well, I will say, so in 2018, I taught a class at Tianjin University in China. It's like extreme northern China, almost up at like the border of North Korea.
Summer spent some time at over there.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I was just there for like a few weeks. They did this like international education week thing where they brought in a bunch of people to teach like these little 1-credit summer classes in English. And while I was there, though, there was this guy who was like a Swedish, I think, like Marxist academic, and he'd heard that students at this university, they had to take Marxism classes. This was a course requirement, and there was a Marxism department. He was like fascinated by this, like and he wanted to meet with these people. When he told me that, I was like, oh yeah, no, bring me along. I definitely want to see what this is like. And it was the strangest thing. So we met with like 2 Marxism professors, and one of them talked a lot more than the other. There was a student who was there like doing a lot of translating, but he kind of tried to press them on like, okay, so like what like Marxist texts are you reading in these Marxism classes? And it was just, they kind of didn't want to say that. And then they like, okay, like what are students supposed to get out of it? And like, it seemed like the answer was that it was about like, having a sense of like personal responsibility and helping to build up the Chinese nation. Those 2 concepts Marx talked about all the time: individual responsibility and Chinese nationalism.
It's in the 14th of Brumaire, isn't it? Right?
yeah, exactly. The 14th. Yeah. And then like eventually, like the guy kept wanting to talk, like the Swedish guy kept wanting to talk about economics, and the guy said some like sort of vaguely like, oh, here are certain controls that you should have, but it was like nothing that would belong in like a Paul Krugman column. And then like one of the last things that the Chinese guy, the Marxism professor, said before somebody had to go to class and the meeting ended was that he, not making this up, this was while Trump was president, of course, that he liked Donald Trump more than he liked Barack Obama because Trump struck him as a strong leader.
So Summer was explaining to me, because she had those, she took those Marxism classes, that in the Chinese context, Marxism, in the PRC context, Marxism exclusively refers to post-Mao Chinese political theory. And if you actually want to read Marx, you have to take the Western Marxism class, which is a completely different stream. It's a little like trying to reconcile, trying to learn about, going to a Chinese Marxism class to learn about Marx is like trying to learn about Catholicism and the legacy of Pope Gregory by going to a Baptist youth group.
Yeah, right.
I mean, technically it's still Christian, but the divergence happened a long time ago.
Fair enough. Well, hey, we should get started with the debate.
They were right. I screwed it up, and I paid the price.
The Oxford Union is an arena whose views and votes have echoed around the world. In 1933, the Union voted in favor of a resolution that this House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. That vote is said to have excited the interest of one Adolf Hitler. Tonight's is a landmark debate, a direct confrontation between a member of the Reagan administration and a leader of a European movement that is intensely critical of the United States. Nothing like this has happened before, so we will be seeing Secretary of Defense Casper Weinberger facing E.P. Thompson, a writer and historian who founded the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and who now devotes himself to what is generally called the European Peace Movement. The debate is based on this resolution. Resolved, this House believes there is no moral difference between the foreign policies of the United States and the Soviet Union. The view of the United States that is implicit in that motion is placing the Western alliance under severe strain, threatening to split it, perhaps even destroy it. Well, this is the battleground. In the tradition of the Oxford Union, Secretary Weinberger will speak from here, Mr. Thompson will speak from there. They will be face to face, about 6 feet apart. With me is Nicholas O'Shaughnessy, a past president of the Oxford Union, which is, I believe, no small honor.
Well, Oxford is a kind of miniature Hollywood, and in the hierarchy of this miniature Hollywood, the presidency is highly regarded by the students, but when you leave, it seems trivial enough.
Mr. Bull, as president of the Oxford Union, you choose the subjects for debate. How did you come to choose this one?
I thought this one would be a rather fascinating fusion between the harsh, sort of amoral world of international affairs and politics that you have represented by Mr. Weinberger from the White House and the Pentagon, and with him coming to Oxford, being able to join in the sort of philosophical debates that have been going on in Oxford since the Middle Ages. That's the type of fusion that I think makes for a really interesting debate. We've had quite a few debates this term examining various issues that are important to the left in this country and abroad. And perhaps
Expect him to be cool, lawyer-like, and
Side, they're determined to avenge Yorktown,
and as no doubt you know, is on
who is reputed to be something of a character.
I am pro-Cruz, I'm pro-America, I'm pro-NATO, I believe in Atlantic Alliance, I believe in deterrence and defense strategy, but I cannot believe the kind of cant and moral claptrap that is paraded by people like Weinberger and Reagan. Just won't wash.
Andrew is a Tory, a Thatcherite. He's on the far right of the political spectrum. E.P. Thompson, as no doubt you know, is on the far left of the political spectrum, the far left of the Labour Party. It's going to be extremely hard for me to try and answer both of their lines of argument in one 7-minute speech and try to put forward a positive case of my own as the first speaker for the opposition.
So I was just trying to skip ahead to where the debate starts, but Andrew Sullivan? That can't. Is that just a coincidence? I don't know. All right, let's see. Let's find the actual beginning here. Is this it? How much fluff do we have before this starts?
Order. I call upon the Secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
Mr. President, sir, honourable members, and for those of you watching at home, hello, good evening and welcome. I'm afraid tonight I'm a little hoarse after losing my voice over the weekend, but I'll do my best. Here are the minutes of the 5th debate of Hillary term 1984. The emergency debate was that this House would rather be dead than French.
It gives me particular pleasure to welcome to this debate the ex-president from Lady Margaret Hall, Miss Benazir Bhutto.
Benazir Bhutto is one of only 6 female presidents of the Oxford Union. She is the
course, the daughter of the executed former Prime Minister of Pakistan, and only weeks ago she was released from several years of house arrest.
So this kind of an amazing like little snapshot, like ruling class gathering from 1984.
And everyone in tuxedos too. That's a bit of a trip, especially given that the president of the union. We skipped the little tail of the tape section where everybody's introducing themselves and going on to do their kind of like pre-game warm up. But these are some very Marxist students. The president of the union at this point was self-identified as a Marxist, but everyone, that's not an excuse for shabby dress.
Right. Yeah, right. Like, well, I mean, I guess about what, like, 15 years before, Christopher Hitchens was a Oxford student, and involved in stuff like this. Read his memoir, and he like has a lot of fun with like thinking back to that and the sort of tension between the the like being a very active member of a student Trotskyist group and having fun like partying with aristocratic reactionaries.
Well, one of the functions of elite educational institutions in the UK was to try to create elite solidarity between the old aristocracy and whatever group was up and coming in society. First it was the gentry, and then the capitalists. Later on, it was the social democrats and Marxists, and that may be one reason why you have this devolution towards Tony Blair, right? Like it's a form of co-optation that starts early, and you can look back on your ideologically compromised forebears, right? Like comrades from previous classes, until you basically converge at a type of neoliberalism that's perfectly harmless to the elite class.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Kind of reminds me of the passage from Leon Trotsky, the Revolution Betrayed, where he's talking about various factors leading to the rise of Stalinism, which he sees as this perversion of the point of the revolution, and most of it's much sort of drier Marxist analysis than this. But I remember a line that always stuck in my head was about the harem, what he calls the harem limousine factor, which is basically party officials like getting used to driving around in nice cars and marrying daughters of the former ruling class, and etc.
There's definitely one of the most dangerous moments of any ideological government is when the first generation, the founding generation, that couldn't possibly be accused of getting in on it for pragmatic reasons, because it was just a pure negative to be a Bolshevik before the revolution.
All that stuff, yeah.
Exactly. When they get successful enough so that they start attracting opportunists and careerists. And there's nothing necessarily, it's inevitable that that'll happen, because that's what occurs when you have young, ambitious people that are part of an order. They want to climb inside of it. But that personality disposition is divorced from ideological commitment. So you need to either indoctrinate them well or have some sorting mechanism to get out the real sociopaths before they can do any damage. Right. Nobody's been particularly good at that.
not a lot of successful examples. But yeah, so this is kind of crazy, right? So this like got this baby Andrew Sullivan, who's already kind of doing Andrew Sullivan shtick of, like, well, I'm a Tory, but, like he's tried to play both ends, much as he's still more or less doing now. We have Benazir Bhutto, introduced as one of the few female heads of the Oxford Union.
Yeah, I'm surprised Henry Kissinger hasn't made an appearance.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Yeah. So probably would have been entertaining to watch all of the story of the tape stuff, but do want to try to come in close to when they actually start the debate.
The motion before the House is that there is no difference between the foreign policies of the USA and the USSR. It therefore gives me great pleasure to call upon Mr. Andrew Sullivan, the ex-president from Magdalen, to propose the motion standing in his name.
If we do talk about morality in foreign policy, we should talk about it in one sense only, and that is when you're killing, murdering, or torturing people throughout the world. That's the only sense in which morality makes sense in this debate.
Mr. President.
Honourable members, honoured guests, Mr. Weinberger can and will, because presumably it's his only option, will defend the killing of people and even the use of nuclear weapons, not by reason of interest or tactics or diplomacy or realpolitik, but by moral reasons. He will defend immorality morally. Let me give you the argument. We in America represent freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union represents tyranny and evil. It is not just our right, but our obligation to promote that freedom and defeat that tyranny. And it's only realistic to use the same methods that evil uses. Otherwise, we will betray good. I know this argument. I've used it several times myself. It's a good argument. It's so good that even Mr. Andropov uses it. We in the Soviet Union represent freedom and democracy.
That is a
The
terrible
United States
accent.
represent tyranny and evil.
It's more Count
It is not
Chocula
just
than
our
anything.
right, but our moral obligation to promote that freedom, etc., etc. Let's not forget that the greatest crimes of human history have been committed by those who claim the moral sanction of ideology. That freedom has been shrieked by evil men as well as good. I believe, Mr. Weinberger, that the lesson of this century is that morality is not to be found in any ideology, be it yours or be it mine. That humanity's interest lies in the triumph of lies not in the triumph of your ideology, but in the defeat of them all, and the rescuing of the word morality from the abuse into which it has fallen. We that are young can see what morality really means. This motion must be carried.
I thank the Honourable Ex-President from Magdalen very much indeed for that speech. I would remind the Honourable Speakers that they should take some note of the time cards, or else they will be cut down in their prime. It gives me great pleasure to call upon Mr. Lawrence Grafstein from Balliol the Librarian to oppose the motion.
One thing that I want to try to show in my speech is that E.P. Thompson is utopian in a sense. I mean, he claims to be speaking for the realists. He claims to be speaking from the prudential standpoint, but I want to try and at least take issue with that.
Thompson and my friend, the ex-president from Magdalen. As E.P. Thompson has made clear in his many eloquent writings, he would do away with the nuclear button. And as Mr. Sullivan implied at points in his speech, under the right circumstances, he just might push it. So America and the Soviet Union may both seek to dominate the world, but they seek domination with a fundamental moral difference. America can accept democracy, diversity, debate, Mr. Sullivan. The Soviet Union cannot. America can accept the existence of different moralities. The Soviet Union cannot. America can admit doubts and mistakes. The Soviet Union cannot. And we will hear a lot of analogies tonight, I fear, from the other side of the House, comparing American and Russian behavior in an effort to show that they amount to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Indeed, analogy has replaced analysis. A few years ago, during the rise of solidarity, we were told that El Salvador was America's Poland. A bit later, El Salvador magically transformed itself into Vietnam. The Lebanon has also recently become Vietnam. Grenada, however, has not managed to transform itself into Vietnam because it was relatively easy. Grenada has instead become America's Afghanistan, even though Afghanistan was once supposed to be Russia's Vietnam because it was relatively hard. The House must remember tonight that the moral pedigree of America is not peculiar to America. In the 17th century, John Locke, a student at this university, developed the classic defense of tolerance. In the 18th century, Edmund Burke made the classic case for representative democracy. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill made a passionate plea for individual and cultural diversity. So in this troubled 20th century, Mr. President, honorable members, we say to you, stand up for what you believe in. Stand up for the right of others to stand up for what they believe in. Stand up for democracy. Stand up for debate. I beg to oppose the motion.
Gotta say, the thing about how America tolerates democracy and diversity, and that's the fundamental difference, and sort of mocking the comparison between the suppression of Solidarność in Poland and what was going on with the death squads in El Salvador, make me think of, I don't remember which book, some Noam Chomsky thing I read a million years ago, but he quotes I think some Salvadoran priest, talking about Lech Walesa visiting the U.S. Right after, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, and talking about how the United States was a beacon of freedom for the world. And the Salvadoran priest said that it's a good thing that Lech Walesa didn't try to start Solidarność in El Salvador, because he wouldn't have been sent to prison. The death squads would have chopped him up into little pieces and left him on the side of the road.
Yeah, there's definitely a kind of Eurocentrism to the whole idea that the United States tolerates freedom, democracy and individual freedom for its sphere of influence, which is kind of true. It's true in Europe, right? There were communist parties that won that representation in European parliaments during the Cold War. Charles de Gaulle wasn't assassinated. He wasn't dragged off in chains to Leavenworth. These things are true, and it's in some ways it's natural for a British audience to center that experience of American hegemony. But as soon as you get out of the Euro-Atlantic world, maybe Japan, then you encounter American-sponsored repression of an incredibly harsh variety, one that becomes equivalent to many of the worst repressive tendencies of the Soviet Union. And that is just waved away, that reality. And Benazir Bhutto, actually, she's an Oxford Union president, a ally of the United States, and Pakistan has gone through periods of extreme political repression against not just the left, but any counter-regime elements. It's a country where you have some of the worst. There are periods. There's open periods and less open periods. But at its worst, Pakistan has both sort of regime security repression combined with an Islamic cultural conservatism that also can have very violent repressive tendencies. And yet, it's the Soviets that are terrible.
Yeah, right, exactly. I think that, certainly, yeah, even Pakistan, but okay, it really is true, even if you say in a posh British accent, that it's ridiculous in advance. But it really is true that the direct equivalent to, Soviets in Eastern Europe would not, of course, be the Americans in Western Europe, but it would be America in Latin America. That really is a pretty direct analogy. In terms of, acted as if the United States, had a right to intervene to get rid of any government that might arise in that sphere that seemed to be violating its interests.
Ask Allende how well the United States tolerates democracy when it cuts against its hemispheric goals.
Yeah. All right.
The argument against the motion has now been made by Lawrence Grafstein.
I do appreciate Andrew Sullivan trying to shelve morality as the appropriate prism for debating foreign policy. There's something very counterproductive about trying to moralize the bloody and practical business of national security and statecraft. And I think that once you get past it and you start just asking, what are the interests? What's the program of the Soviets? What's the program of the Americans? What tactics are they using to achieve that? Is that program something desirable to realize or not? Mm-hmm. Then you can actually have a conversation. But if you're trying to find virtue in foreign relations, unless you're going to limit yourself to basically Bhutan and Costa Rica, mm-hmm. you're not going to. The empirical evidence is not even going to be commensurable for that framework.
Yeah. So, I guess it depends what you mean. So I think that certainly are the goals desirable is a important question, but I do think as much as I hate to agree with Andrew Sullivan, that are we funding people who rape nuns and torch orphanages is is also a fair question, a fair question to ask. It might be of course, I think that there's a sense in which in which you could say that inevitably, go back to the okay, what if the left takes power question, that if you're that if you're going to do anything in the world, right, that you are going to have to interact and cooperate with terrible people who do terrible things. So in that sense, right, I'm happy to take the virtue out, but I don't know. Given the actual resolution topic, that there's no moral difference, between the foreign policies of the United States and the USSR, then that's it's a moral question. You kind of have to give it a moral answer.
Well, looking at there's certain types of foreign intervention or foreign policy, security related foreign policy work that it's impossible to do cleanly. If you're going to intervene in a civil war, maybe because one side is more sympathetic than the other, maybe because one side is closer to your own interests, and this is a strategic area, you need a safe pair of hands in it, then you're going to be killing people. Any use of the military, you're going to be killing people. You're going to be doing questionable, morally reprehensible things on a tactical basis. The more broken country is, the harder, the more atrocious the reality of the security situation, and the uglier the people that you need to work with. Like in Congo, if you want to achieve some kind of stability, you're going to have to cut deals with warlords that have done terrible things, because the security environment selects out actors that play by the rules of morality. And if you're a superpower with global pretensions, then you're going to be playing in some of these extraordinarily brutal environments. Many of them probably have been created as a result, either deliberate or inadvertent, of your own policies. And at the end of the day, if you're dealing with non-rapists in order to conclude a civil war, that's different than if you're dealing with non-rapists in order to stoke a civil war.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're arming the non-rapists, then you might say that it's to conclude it, or you'd like to conclude if it's on your terms. But much less sympathetic to that. I mean, if you're negotiating, a peace with them, sure, the non-rapists unfortunately are going to have to be, at the table. But I certainly agree with that. But I think that I don't know. I mean, I guess my answer to the first part would be, at the risk of sounding like a hippie, don't intervene in other people's civil wars. That there's very rarely, any good excuse for doing that.
No, I think that you're absolutely correct. And one thing that I encountered a lot in Washington foreign policy circles was the utter unwillingness to countenance doing nothing as an option. So
yeah, right. Doing nothing, or always my favorite thing to say in arguments about shouldn't we do something to help with this situation, is there is almost always something on the table that people don't want to consider in this, which is letting people fleeing from this situation come live in the United States. Like that is actually a big significant something that that we could generally do to help people, but that's not generally considered to be something here. But I mean, I do take the larger point. I mean, it's like, I haven't read it yet, but I mean, I take this to be some of the point that like Samuel Moyn is making in his new book, which is that it's sort of a dangerous delusion that you can do, that you can have it both ways, that that you could do interventionism, but you could do like the morally clean interventionism where you don't do any human rights violations.
Yeah, and that having a clarity as to what the costs are, what the implications are of intervention, and that not intervening is an option, or maybe not intervening yourself. Maybe there's somebody else who could intervene better than you can. And you should just support them if they're a partner. Or, for instance, Russia and Syria, in a lot of ways, every party in the Syrian civil war, with the exception of the YPG, was fairly atrocious. And the Russian intervention managed to be effective while also minimizing their entanglements and their complicity. Now, it's not great to be an enabler to the Assad regime, but the case that this intervention prevented a greater evil, you could make that call. In America's involvement in Syria, there was this strange combination of a willingness to get in the dirt and to partner with what the Russian media started calling moderate terrorists, which I particularly liked.
Turn of phrase, yes.
But not actually having, for all of your violence, for all of your munitions, for all of your intervention, and for all of your moral compromises, you're not actually even achieving the goal of your intervention. And in that case, I think it's fairly obvious that doing nothing in Syria would have been a superior option. It was Barack Obama's first choice. He leaned that way. But it's treated as inadmissible by the foreign policy establishment, and that there's a real pressure practically in Washington and in US media that to prove your morality and your toughness by doing the horrible violent interventions, that you can't be a serious person until you've bombed some country.
Yeah, definitely. Which ironically, Andrew Sullivan was a big exponent of a couple decades after this debate. I remember watching him on the Bill Maher show in the early 2000s as just a as a really frank apologist, for the war on terror. I remember there was a point where Maher interviewed Noam Chomsky, and Andrew Sullivan was like mad at him that he'd interviewed Chomsky, that he hadn't yelled at him, and actually, funnily enough, I mentioned Hitchens earlier, is obviously on my mind because of the book, but there's a clip. It was played on, I saw it because it was played on TMBS a couple of years ago, of Sullivan and Hitchens, who at that point, this is 2002, they both supported the drive for war in Iraq, but somehow or another they're on C-SPAN, and either one of them or the moderator or a caller, starts talking about Israel, and at that point, there's like enough of the early good Hitchens, left in him, that he's like, well, no, clearly the Palestinians have a legitimate complaint, it's not like Al Qaeda. And Sullivan is like mad at him for saying that, and not being willing to just simplistically denounce Palestinian terrorism and acknowledge that whatever the IDF wants is also good.
Yeah, I think that when it became a civilizational conflict, right, when it could be presented in those terms, a war, you had a lot of people who would not want to compromise their ethics for purely political ideology, but make it a war of religion, and all of a sudden things are a little bit different. My understanding is that Andrew Sullivan is like Catholic. He's gay but Catholic, and he has this kind of medieval animus against Islam, where the rules of sort of polite statecraft don't really apply.
Right. Yeah, right. Like maybe even maybe when Latin American socialists were getting slaughtered, like he could he could see both sides of that, but
it's priests, right? When it's actual good Catholic clergy,
right?
It's obvious who you should side with.
Yeah, right. No, that
especially since the Americans are Proddies, right?
Right. That's true. All right, let's keep going.
Speaker of Congress, son of a member of the Canadian Senate, and self-interested in going into politics, and to judge by the applause with which he was greeted, the clear winner of round one in this debate.
Wilson of St. Anthony's to speak third and in favour of the motion.
Mr. President,
I think the debate is
Honourable
very
members,
much in the American
distinguished
corner.
guests,
That was an extremely
Mr.
persuasive
Weinberger.
case, argued with much eloquence by Lawrence Grafstein, and the sympathies of the House are now
gullible
clearly with the
does the
American
librarian
scientists, the result of a telling
we are?
and powerful speech.
morals are about motivations and consequences. And in the context of foreign policy, this is especially so. Morality, by its definition, involves choice. The choice between self-interest and other interest. There is a dangerous heresy which leads us to believe that our survival, our very lives, depend on one or the other of the superpowers. We call them superpowers in deference to their top dog mentality. But who are they? Two ossified gerontocracies who hold us in mortal fear under the protection of their nuclear umbrellas, telling us that we need them, while we get dragged into their proxy wars being fought across the globe. Honorable members, let us show these two charlatans that we can do without them. Let us show them that we can do bloody well without them. I urge you to support this motion.
Imagine, if you will, a visitor from another planet hovering over Europe, looking down at the SS-20s and the Pershings. Now, I suppose that they could not discern any moral difference between those nuclear weapons pointed at each other. Suppose that that same visitor 40 years ago were to see the weapons of Hitler and the weapons of the Allies. Again, no moral difference between the weapons. Nevertheless, there underlies just as much today as there did 40 years ago a political division beneath that military strategy. There is no Europe in the middle. There is no such thing as Europe in the middle. We are together. The nuclear problem is our problem. We must solve it together. And we can wrench from under that problem the political ideologies that have held us together. There is too great a tendency, I think, to look at morality as an on-off switch, to list the mistakes of the United States and the Soviet Union, to say a plague on both your houses. And that's a sort of vision that reminds one of the magnificent equanimity of the French law, which said that both rich and poor alike were forbidden from begging and sleeping under bridges. Our perceptions can't be quite so inadequate to permit no finer distinctions. There's no need, I think, to make excuses for my government's mistakes, and there have been many. In the United States, as in anywhere else, foreign policy is a tool of economic and security policy. But there is in the United States foreign policy another creed, a sort of American creed, a support for liberal, democratic, individual, and egalitarian values. Now, we have always fallen short of reaching those goals. It's what Robert Penn Warren called the burr under the saddle. And everyone in the world can see the national torment that comes to the United States when it fails to reach those goals. That's what you saw in the United States over the war in Vietnam, over the use of the CIA in covert actions. We attempt to change those things. In the United States, that sort of libertarian, egalitarian value can change foreign policy. It's possible to change. But there's much that is lousy on both sides. The world is a lousy place. It's also a crazy place. I'm 23 years old, and no less than any one of you who has antipathy for the United States, I'm sick of old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in. Still, it seems to me that we do ourselves no good to deny what is good in a system which is not all good, to deny what is good in a system which can correct itself, and that is the United States. I think one political analyst in the United States put it best when he said, critics say that America is a lie because it does not reach its ideals. America is not a lie. It's a disappointment. But it's a disappointment only because it is also a hope. I beg to oppose, Mr. President.
America is a disappointment, but it is a disappointment because it is also a hope. That kind of emotional finale has done well for Mr. Kaiser and a number of states.
You could make the same claim about the Soviet Union. I mean, post Stalin, Stalin was a disappointment and a mistake, but there is a dream that they would do better. And the truth is that again, this is some Eurocentrism at play here, right? Like, ask the Viet Minh, ask the Cuban anti-imperialists, ask the Angolans, ask Nelson Mandela, which superpower they placed their hope in, and you're going to get a very different answer than this. Of course, the Americans, meanwhile, of course, the Americans are the good guys.
Yeah, right. But the Soviet Union was, was definitely backing, lots of people who were, engaged in
national liberation struggles.
National liberation struggles, and the struggle against apartheid you mentioned in South Africa. And you could also plausibly claim that that since that disappointment, of the Stalin era, by 1984, there have been tons of reforms, in the last few decades in the Soviet Union.
De-Stalinization. The Soviet Union admitted mistakes. It course corrected.
Right.
Which is in what the opposing side claims it is incapable of doing.
Yeah, and I'll also say that last presentation, A+ for rhetoric, but D- for argument, that he says, he's got this nice setup, that the aliens, of course, wouldn't see any difference, between the two sides with nukes, pointed at each other. But, when they see differences, between the Nazis and the U.S., the other Western allies, no, they couldn't. Okay, it's a nice turn, right? Because he's sort of drawing us into this view from 10,000 feet and then reminding us of World War II, which is always the thing that you do in the U.S. and the U.K. when you want to assert moral authority. You dredge up World War II. I remember Peter Hitchens, actually, who's a fairly intense religious conservative, but is a good writer, had a line in his book The Rage Against God where he says that the real religion that he was raised in wasn't Christianity, it was "We won the war."
And there is a certain timeliness to this debate, because one difference, in a lot of ways, you could have a very similar debate today, but one difference that certainly has taken place is that the statute of limitations on invoking World War II is kind of run out, right? That was persuasive at that point, but now that we've seen what the United States does with the power and legitimacy that it derived from that World War II victory, it's hard to credit it anymore.
Right. Exactly. Also, we could just rerun your original point in an even simpler way here, because you could say, hey, imagine the version of this, the Oxford Union is a very culturally unique thing, but so I'm sure there was not, in fact, a Leningrad Union, but pretend that there was, the equivalent debate happening there. Say, hey, so, sure, an alien could tell the difference between our weapons and the weapons of the American imperialists, but then again, they also wouldn't be able to tell the difference between, the weapons of the Red Army and the weapons of Hitler, in 1942. And, and it would have had the same, moral oomph to it, in that context.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another thing that that the opposing side completely elides, which is, if you're going back to World War II, well, the Soviets are part of the Allies, right? They're, in fact, they kind of do the heavy lifting. In fact, they kind of won the war. So maybe different example.
Yeah, right. If you're going to talk about the evils of the Soviet Union, World War II is not your best case.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that seems right. But it's also just okay, why do we have to go to the aliens, right? in order, like if, ultimately he's doing the, Oxford debate equivalent of the Twitter thing where, as they say, you make up a guy to get mad at, right? That like they're sort of making up an argument to oppose this thing about the aliens. Like, why does it have to be aliens? Why can't it be Salvadorans?
And also, it's another way. I've been keeping track of the Nazi references, and the whole opposed side is oriented against the notion of moral equivalency in foreign policy, right? You can't, sometimes we may make mistakes, but you can't lump us in with them. But every reference to the Third Reich has been an implicit moral equivalence between them and the Soviet Union.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very true. If you're not allowed to, compare things to things that are worse than them, then we've definitely violated that rule. I also think that the whole moral equivalence issue is really strange because, not the most popular guy, in the 2021 left, but I remember reading Glenn Greenwald in the late 2000s, making this point that like there's something very strange about like people will trot out, will refer to the idea that the United States is morally equivalent to some group or force or country we all agree is really bad as moral relativism, but it's actually the opposite of moral relativism. It's applying the same standards to everybody, and giving them the same grade if they fail the standards.
Well, I think actually this is another case where I think that America's Protestant heritage is relevant. The yardstick for a certain kind of Protestant morality has to do with what's in your heart, right? Your relationship with Jesus, the quality of your soul. So it doesn't matter what you do. If you're a good person, that quality remains, right? You're a good person who's done bad things.
Right.
And that is categorically different than a bad person who does bad things.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the body count is of all the bad things you did, because you're a good person. So it can be tragic, it can be sad, it can be a mistake, but it's not a crime. It's not a sin like what the other guy is doing.
Yeah, right. I mean, which you see all the time. Like, the worst thing, generally speaking, that you're allowed to say about American foreign policy, especially like, now it's getting to, we're just entering into a different era where, it's a little bit more acceptable in mainstream discourse to say things that fall outside of this. But certainly in like 2014, absolutely the worst thing you're allowed to say about the war in Iraq or the war in Vietnam or the long string of coups that the United States supported against democratically elected governments in Latin America is that they were mistakes, right? Everything's a mistake. It's like, whoops, we invaded Iraq.
Yeah, exactly. And despite the fact that they might eventually be evaluated as mistakes, there's no accountability for it, right? If you vehicular manslaughter is still a crime, right? The court may determine that you didn't mean to do it, right? It was just a mistake. There were some road conditions. Maybe you weren't paying attention. Maybe you were a little drowsy. You're not a bad person, but you killed a guy, right? And that's kind of why we're here. We're not here to adjudicate whether or not you're going to go to heaven or whether Jesus likes you. We're here to adjudicate whether you killed this guy, and you totally did. So that seems to be the bigger issue. But that preoccupation with the internal morality, with the character of the country and the system, that's kind of what I was getting at the beginning when I said that morality shouldn't enter the evaluation of foreign policy. It doesn't matter
Right. No, I got you. So maybe a different way to frame that point is we should be concerned with justice. We should not particularly be concerned with personal morality. You know, that it's not that, you know, whether, you know, I mean, this like the you know, people who, you know, like in a lot of Israeli political culture, you know, within like relatively liberal domains of it, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on how, like, you know, those Israelis who feel bad about, you know, about what they did in the army to Palestinians, you know, that they're showing how virtuous they are, you know, the shoot and cry thing. And that's, you know, maybe relevant to your evaluation of those individual people, maybe. But it's certainly not relevant to what you think about, you know, Israeli policy in the West Bank, you know, as a whole. And it's particularly strange to sort of use that yardstick to think about the foreign policies of entire nations, because of course the trick is always that, like, when you have that Protestant mindset that you're talking about, which, you know, I really like that way of putting it, you know, that always reminds me of you know, of Adolf Reed, you know, talking about left moralism. You know, it's you know, it's a bit too Protestant, you know, approach to politics. Mm-hmm. But you know, it's like the trick when you apply it to entire nations is, yeah, of course you're going to think that people in your nation are internally good because they're vivid to you. You know, you think of them as human beings with complex inner lives, whereas you don't think of, you know, Russians or you know, Arabs,
Muslims.
Sure, you know,
you name it.
You think of those as like exotic ciphers, you know. So you don't spend a lot of time thinking of them in that light. But you know, that's just a function of distance.
And it's also not traumatizing for you to think of them as being evil, right? If you're wedded to a notion of external behavior reflecting some kind of internal morality, or you're preoccupied with internal moral character of your society, that preoccupation, that value just doesn't apply to others because it doesn't reflect on you.
Right.
It doesn't matter if other people live in a good country, but you want to live in a good country. And the reality is that we should just get comfortable with the idea that countries aren't good or bad. They are organizations that exist to perform certain functions, and if they get out of control, which they sometimes do, then we should think about how to correct them or wind them down.
Yeah, and I really like that phrase, you know, organizations that exist to perform certain functions. You know, I was thinking about this because last week, I think Varn and I watched the Alexander Dugin, Bernard-Henri Lévy debate from a few years ago, and which, by the way, like, Dugin totally wins, like, if only because he's, you know, much smarter, you know, than Bernard.
Yeah, I mean, like, as soon as you said Bernard-Henri Lévy was the other side, it's like, yeah, Dugin's going to win that one.
Yeah, clearly, right? You know, he's much better at this, but like listening to Dugin talk about nationalities, right? You know, about nations as if they as if they represented these like eternal archetypes from Plato's head, you know, like the realm of the forms or something. You know, it's just like the more you think about that, the more ridiculous it is. You know.
It's in some ways I get it, right? Poland is Polish political culture is one of the dominant strains is this Dugin style ethno-nationalism with like a sacred community trans-historical membership in it, and it sort of replaces God as the metaphysical grounding for human life and for morality, and it gives you a sense of continuity through time. It alleviates some of the mortality anxiety because you're going to live on through the nation.
Right.
It gives you clarity about how to understand the world. But yeah, like really, I mean, these you don't see how these are constructed categories, right? Like you can't imagine yourself speaking a different language and wearing slightly different traditional clothes and therefore falling on the wrong side of the trans-historical ethnic fault line. But it's funny too, because Dugin probably would be more comfortable with the idea that, you know, Russia is not necessarily good, but he'd be like, it doesn't matter. It's still Russia. That's the important thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, and I mean, I think in his case, like, all right, the internet cut out here for a minute. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right, outstanding. Yeah, so what I was saying when the internet flaked out was, you know, I think in Dugin's case, there's like sort of a weird combination of ultra traditionalism and moral relativism. Like, well, you know, you've got your Western liberal values, and that's nice for you. You know, they like we've got our good Russian values, and you know, I'm not going to try to make some sort of transcendental argument for that. But yeah. I mean, like it is a, like, even just as like a straightforward historical issue, it's bizarre to treat like the nations that happened, like the nation states that happen to exist right now, as if there were things that had existed for thousands of years. And
the eternal Montenegro.
yeah, exactly. Never mind, you know, just like, you know, on a more basic human level, thinking that like you actually, you know, have some deep sense of connection, you know, to people based on it, etc. You know, that because, you know, like, yeah, I mean, the country that this debate is taking place in, you know, like like pretending that the UK is the same country as like the, you know, I don't know, the kingdom that's ruled by William the Conqueror or whatever, you know, is just like a deeply silly, weird thing to do, you know, but without that, you sort of don't get nationalism in any form.
Yeah, and the thing is, at least it's not sports fandom.
Fair enough. All right, we should go back to that.
We haven't even gotten to the main event, right? This is still the warm-up.
Mr. President, honorable members, both Russia and America are psychologically Cambridge men.
Oh yeah, this is the comic relief. The next two guys just basically make Oxford jokes. A lot of Francophobia.
Just such a bizarre thing that this is part of the program. But yep, there we go.
Apparently, it's like a palate cleanser before you get the senior people in. But yeah, I don't know how essential it is, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, let's see how long this lasts. All right, well, let's just get a little flavor.
British, I don't want to be dictated to by American. And therefore, I say to you, to paraphrase John Kennedy, all free men, wherever they may live, are members of the Oxford Union.
Nation of North Atlantic North Atlantic states. But Mr. Speaker, they have made that choice. I hope we will continue such a policy.
This guy makes it weirdly eatable. His first line is, I understand tyranny and living under repression because I had a mom and 3 older sisters, which is the same as having 4 mothers. You know, Freud much.
All right. Well, hey, let's see if we can. Where are we?
There we go.
Yeah.
He is a kind of bull figure to various anti-nuclear movements which have arisen in the United Kingdom, Germany, and many other European countries.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Weinberger, I also wish to express my pleasure that Mr. Weinberger is here. I think this is a recognition not only of the standing of this House, but a recognition also, an understanding of the depth of concern in Europe and in this country on the issues of peace. And I welcome it also as one of those signs of the openness of the American communications and intellectual system. Now, Mr. Weinberger will find some Europeans, many British, in an ill humor today. He shouldn't be surprised. He is himself something of a philosopher, a rigorous thinker on questions of deterrence. In his defense report for the fiscal year of 1984, he wrote out some of his reflections. Deterrence, he said, is a dynamic effort, not a static one. And he set out a view of an entire continuum over which deterrence had to be not only effective, but constantly modernized and enhanced, linking the highest level of conventional arms to the lowest threshold of nuclear weapons. A continuum in regions, a continuum in ranges of missiles, a continuum in time itself for the possibility of an extended war. It's very easy to talk about theater when you're in a games room, when you're looking at a globe or a map. When you actually live inside the theater, and when the polemics and the missiles are going over your head and perhaps might come onto the theater itself from the born-again Christians on one side and the stillborn Marxists on the other, then it's the time to begin to watch one's head. And now the first flights of these missiles, owned and operated by the United States, are here on our territory, and they are for our greatest security. Do we really feel more secure because Cruz and Pershing have come? No one feels more secure. Neither the Europeans, nor the Soviet people, nor the people of the United States. For very good reasons. First of all, the military scenario has always been absurd, I think insane. These serpent's eggs are there, and more are coming. By the way, perhaps we could ask Mr. Weinberger when the next flights will come. All these serpent's eggs are now packed on a site in Britain whose location, thanks to the action of some of my fellow countrywomen and their friends from North America and Europe and elsewhere, has been rather well advertised. Even the British people know where the cruise missiles are. I think probably the Soviet Union knows where they are. And if the evil empire is anxious to make a preemptive strike, as we are told by some people, then all the eggs can be smashed in one basket in a perfect Pearl Harbor. It's insane. Although I would reassure Mr. Weinberger, the situation isn't quite as bad as that. We have got a fence around these missiles. In fact, we've got quite a tall fence. We've now got 3 fences. And we've got them encircled, pretty well encircled, by soldiers and by police, and best encircled of all by the Greenham Common women, and outside by the peace movement and the nation. And all we have to do to make them completely safe is to get the police to turn around and face the other way. I remember saying at a meeting in Comiso in Sicily 18 months ago, we've been saying this up and down Europe, that the dragon's teeth zone in Comiso and Greenham Common would spring up as armed missiles on the other side. And so it has taken place. Any child could see them. Any child. Why can eminent statespersons not understand what Auden wrote in agony at the commencement of World War II? I and the public know what all school children learn: those to whom evil is done do evil in return. And I put as central to my case 2 documents. Don't worry, I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to show them to you. And these were part of the propaganda which led up to this disastrous situation. One is called Soviet Military Power, and it has a foreword by Mr. Weinberger, and it is a Sears Roebuck catalog of all the deadly military equipment, whether naval or air or ground, possessed by the Soviet Union and its rate of development. And the other, which was produced in answer to it, is called Whence the Threat to Peace. I don't know what the analogy for Sears Roebuck is in the Soviet Union, but it is a Sears Roebuck catalog, rather better illustrated because they could get the illustrations more easily from the United States press of all the barbarous military equipment being developed in the United States. They've even copied each other in maps. I don't know if you can see, but here is a power projection in the United States catalog with a huge Soviet Union, Mr. President, a huge Soviet Union, with arrows going in every direction around the world. And in the Sears Roebuck catalog from the Soviet Union of America, Soviet Union is rather smaller. All the arrows are attached. All the arrows are attached.
There's some very Cold War specific issues that are coming up here. For instance, all of his references to nuclear weapons and the prospect of global total war between the 2 sides. It's harder to relate to that now because even the US-China, actually in some ways, I think our situation is more dangerous now because there was a clarity that a Soviet-American war would be, civilization ending. There's a perception that a conflict between the PRC and the United States would be regional, right? You'd still have 1 billion dead, but they'd all be in Asia. And I actually think that the same rules applies with the Soviet Union. If there is a serious, if there's an outbreak of general war between the PRC and the United States, then that's the ball game.
Yeah, which does make it particularly terrifying when you see like conservatives, freaking out, about Milley, like reassuring his counterpart in China that the United States, wasn't going to start a war that would be catastrophic for everybody involved, because you'd think that like avoiding that outcome, right, which would just like override any other possible objection that you could have to this. I mean, you know, what is the worst thing that could happen? You know, I mean, in the world today, realistically, probably the very worst thing that could happen would be a war between the United States and China. And you think that like anything that was done in terms of, you know, talking people down or cooling tempers, reassuring everybody that this wouldn't happen, you know, would be laudable. But, you know, but I mean, this is something that's been portrayed as, you know, as this big betrayal. You know, it's like, oh, but what if Trump had wanted to start a war with China?
Yeah, how could you do that? Don't you believe in the doctrine of executive privilege? Right? There's this weird elevation of some procedural quirks of the American system of government as and sacralizing them into something that's worth starting a war over, worth fighting for. And no, I mean, it's just an administrative. It's a tool that exists so you don't fight wars, right? Or that's how it should be used. And yet, the level of offense, the affront taken when you might not be sufficiently patriotic or deferential to, especially norms related to American security measures, are that is heresy and treason. And one thing that, and you have Milley having to do that because the Soviets and the Americans at least had some clarity that this is a real thing, and they had institutionalized some measures to engage in, you know, regular dialogue. There was the red phone in Moscow and DC, and a whole raft of treaties and agreements that were meant to contain the threat of global annihilation. And the United States, since the end of the Cold War, has dismantled those structures with respect to Russia, and has done nothing to create alternatives, which might engage China. And there's the badness of doing that damage, of undoing all of these agreements, all of these treaties, arms limitations agreements, things of that nature. But there's also what I think is the much more severe damage that's done by the Chinese, the Russians, and other potential adversaries of the United States, seeing that the United States is the kind of country that undoes these safeguards. Because how can you trust them?
Right. Yeah. Which by the way, you know, like there's this deeply absurd belief that some paleoconservatives, some libertarians, maybe a few contrarian leftists have that Donald Trump was some sort of like, you know, right-wing isolationist, who for that reason, like was actually like anti-war somehow or something like that, which one is particularly weird that people are repeating that now because, hey, Joe Biden, actually ended the 20-year war in Afghanistan, which is a Band-Aid that Trump was definitely not willing to completely tear off on his watch. But also, I mean, related to what you're saying, I mean, that trust issue, I mean, like the ending
the Iran deal.
Yeah.
Insanity.
That is the most dangerous thing that's probably happened in, the last several years, was walking out of that deal, which not only was part of a process of bringing the United States closer to the brink of war with Iran, that we've been in, decades, but also undermines the possibility of any future diplomacy, frankly, with anybody, because it sends the signal. It's like, hey, whatever, if the, if the other party wins, they'll just take it away again if they want.
And it's not just the Iranians either. It was a multilateral agreement which involved Russia, China, and the EU. So you're going after all of them. You're alienating every single power at a single chop without having any alternative in place, apart from just the naked use of force.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also think, like, going back to the Billy thing, like, all right, so you could, I don't want to say there's no competing value there. There is, which is that, you don't want generals, sort of
back channeling to foreign powers.
You don't want them, I think, generally, deciding policy, on their own. That's a bad thing. That's a bad thing to do. And to the extent that you could say that, that was being violated here, that's bad. Now, I think that the value of not having a war with China, like, clearly overrides that. But I could see you saying that's bad. But, like, okay, shouldn't we apply the same thing to, like, see as, like, much more scandalous, like, Stanley McChrystal in 2009, giving a speech in London, saying that, like, we had to stay in Afghanistan, while his commander-in-chief was still supposedly deliberating about that, like that seems, like, if we're going to institute the principle, it sounds like a nice principle, but, like, this wouldn't be the case that I would start with.
No, it's true. And the main argument for Trump being anti-war is that he was outside of the foreign policy and military-industrial complex entanglements that typically come with career politicians, which was kind of true. He didn't mind pissing off the foreign policy establishment. He didn't mind yelling at generals, but that does not make him anti-war. It's true that those establishments represent a serious obstacle to a sustainable peace internationally. But if the alternative is Trumpian peak driving world historical events, then, not better.
Yeah, right. It's I think the thing that would be honest to say about Trump's 4-year foreign policy record is that it was more unpredictable, than previous presidents. But
that's exactly what you want from a dominating superpower, an unreliable hegemon. Yay!
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's go back to it.
And they make the most evil book known in the whole human record. We know now that through last autumn, this power lay in the hands of two elderly men, one of whom was on a kidney machine and half dead from the neck down, and the other of whom, in the view of his critics, was on a water cure machine and half dead from the neck up.
Auto cue machine, that is to say, a telephone.
There is now a formidable United States presence everywhere, Oman, Turkey, Iceland, South Korea, Egypt, Diego Garcia. What are they doing at Diego Garcia? Somalia. What are you doing there? What moral interest is here? If anything, I would say, of the two, the United States administration under President Reagan has been more threatening in its military posture. But the Soviet has been more responsible for the ideological and security blockages which prevent any healing process in the world to begin. But no micrometer can find a moral difference in the postures of hostility. And I want to ask when Mr. Weinberger is here, what is this quarrel about? It is an irrational condition. It consists in itself. The superpowers feel threatened because they are threats to each other and have historically become so. It is an acquired inertia. It is a self-reproducing system. When at a certain historical moment, At the end of World War II, the armies met and caused a divide like a geological fault across the center of our continent. You then had, as a product of those particular historical circumstances and contingencies, the origin of the Cold War. You can look back there for moral differences. But now, after 35 years, there is no more morality. Each side pretends to moral superiority. The Soviet Union pretends to be a socialist heartland, but it fears most of all democratic socialist impulses. Hence Prague, the crushing of the Prague Spring in '68. Hence the crushing of the self-activating working class movement of Solidarność in Poland. And I want to say it is you. It is the Western military posture which repeatedly gives to the old post-Stalinist rulers an extended historical tenure. It is the evil empire claptrap, the sworn enemies claptrap that Mrs. Thatcher was using only last year, which causes prison doors to close on the other side, which leads to the tightening of security systems, which gives a justification and a legitimacy to the Stalinist leadership, which has outlasted.
With the greatest respect, sir, do you really believe that Mrs. Thatcher's voice, or Mr. Reagan's voice, as shrill as we all agree they are, is responsible for the closing of prison doors in the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union? What about the Soviet aid, the moral agents who are leaders in the Kremlin, or who are the ones with the policies? I can't see how you could hold someone's words responsible for someone else's deed.
Oh, no. Ah, yes. I thank you I thank you for this correction. I said accomplices. I hope I said accomplices. I hope that was my word. And Americans should reflect how it happened. There's never been in this century any major war on American territory, and long may and forever may that continue. But if some 40 years ago, by way of Canada, invading armies had come into New England, had sacked Boston, Providence, New Haven, Albany, Rochester, Buffalo, had gone as far west as Detroit, had invested New York, so that New Yorkers died by 1/3 of the population, ate shoe leather, burnt their books and their floorboards, as the Leningrad people did, had got to the borders of Washington, as Hitler's armies got to Moscow, had then fought block by block right into the heart of Chicago, as happened to Stalingrad, left 20 million dead, then the United States might have made, after that, a client buffer zone of Canada. The first moral difference, I am coming to conclusion, Mr. President. The first moral difference that will appear, will be when any nation, either superpower, takes an actual act of disarmament, then we can start to talk about morality. Until that happens, I rest my case on these two odious books, and I ask Oxford to support our motion in the name of a universalism at its very foundation in the Middle Ages, a universalism of scholarship which owed its duty to the skills of communication and learning and not to those of the armed state. And those skills, I ask Oxford to call a conference of the universities of East and West to make its contribution to the healing process of Europe. The strongest poison ever known came from Caesar's laurel crown, as Blake wrote. I support this motion in the confidence that this House will reject the poison of Caesar.
Yeah, that was interesting. That wasn't that's not certainly I think maybe the most obvious way to to make that case, but depending,
not in 2021, and it does have a kind of 1980s vintage to it, which doesn't mean it's wrong, but the preoccupation with nuclear annihilation, the anxiety of general war, the concentration on the focus on Europe, that's all of its time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that. It does seem to me like it would have been stronger, if there had been, certainly more about, American, crimes there. But it was still an interesting, overall, presentation. So, I mean, I guess the first part was roughly that, the United States and Soviet Union's foreign policies are equivalent because they're both, doing brinksmanship, and then the second part, was about and again, I think at this point it becomes a little bit unclear what moral equivalence is actually supposed to mean in this context. Like, again, what's the moral concept that we're talking about here? And,
well, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Well, no, I mean, in a strange way, like it sort of seems like Thompson's argument is pitched at that kind of Protestantish, conception that you were talking about earlier, that like, being morally good is not necessarily about what you do. It's about having understandable motivations. And in the last part, even though, after all the parts where he's denouncing the Soviet Union, as doing nuclear brinksmanship, as suppressing democratic socialist movements, within its sphere of influence. In the last part, it seems like what Thompson is trying to do is something like show that the Soviet Union is no worse because it's doing what it does out of, understandable motivations, that if the United States had experienced all the horrors, that they did, it might have acted similarly.
And I think that that's he's making an appeal to empathy there, and which I think is valid. And I think that he makes a point early on that the superpowers are threatened by each other because they are threatening each other. It is not insanity on the part of the Soviet Union or on the part of the United States to build up their military capabilities and to engage in brinksmanship or foreign interventions when everything is at stake. You have attempts at subversion. You have actual hot wars fought in places like Korea and Vietnam. These are, even when they're distant from the center, the behavior of the other superpower can be read as challenging, as a direct threat to you. And it doesn't help that the rhetoric often consists of threats of annihilation as well. And so I think that he bases his equivalence on that aggressive posture. And at the end, I really like the challenge that he puts down, that the real moral high ground will be won by whoever takes steps towards disarmament. Both countries say that they want peace, but they behave in ways that make you question that. Right. So it's time to, if you want people to trust your commitment to peace, you have to do something to demonstrate it. And given that you have a stalemate in Europe, while the U.S. is threatened by the Warsaw Pact is threatened by NATO, why not get rid of both? Why isn't that ever on the table? Or why isn't general nuclear disarmament ever on the table? And frankly, I think he's right. if you want to gain confidence and trust as a responsible world power, even more so under conditions of unipolar hegemony than when you have an evenly divided Cold War standoff, then you actually have to deliver on your claims for general peace, security, demilitarization. And the United States is the Pentagon budget now is higher than it was, I think, even per capita during the Cold War. So the American commitment to peace seems to be entirely rhetorical and entirely disingenuous.
Yeah, I mean, we had like 10 years of people asking why there was no peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, and reinvestment, domestic priorities, and defunding the Pentagon, and then that, of course, went away after 9/11 when Bush and then his successors, decided that a tiny organization that could maybe had the capacity to try to blow up an airplane or a nightclub once every 5 years, was a civilizational threat on the level of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and justified everything.
And it's comic. The one point that one sort of consequence of my sort of results first analysis of international foreign policy is I don't really care what motivations state actors have. What kind of bothers me the most about the United States isn't the self-interestedness of American foreign policy, but how bad it is, but the inefficiency. You have a tremendous amount of economic waste, a tremendous amount of environmental devastation, which are on top of an atrocious body count, just an ocean of human suffering created by American foreign policy. And what do you have to show for it? What good has it done you? And that alone would, in my mind, disqualify Washington as being, the hegemon of anything.
Yeah, right. You should be less interested in what's going on in the interior of somebody's soul, which is usually unknowable in any case, and much more interested in their effect on the world. I can certainly get behind that. All right. Well, speaking of which, let's watch
Casper Weinberger.
Yes.
Rousing speech, as you can hear from the applause. Mr. Thompson warned Secretary Weinberger that Europe was, as he put it, meditating a declaration of independence. He said that Western Europe must make a space between the two powers. He mentioned nuclear-free zones as something that would be desirable. He said that there would be a true moral difference between the United States and the Soviet Union when one power or the other took an act of common. The President of the Union will now call on Secretary Weinberger.
It is a great honor and it gives me very great pleasure to introduce to this society Casper Weinberger, U.S. Secretary of Defense, to speak sixth and against this motion.
President, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor indeed to have the opportunity to be here tonight and to participate in this debate, and I have welcomed the opportunity and look forward to it for a long time. I was warned that one of the greatest perils that I faced here tonight was the unremitting and preternatural chill of this building. You have, in a very friendly way, eliminated that threat and given us a nice, warm television studio in which to discuss these critically important matters. It does seem to me that if we are to debate the moralities of the two systems, we should look at Soviet definitions and our definitions. The Soviet definition has always been that moral policy is what advances the Soviet state. That moral policy is what is helps the cause of communism. Brezhnev said it many times, and indeed it is part of the litany. It is a moral system which turns the definition of the word moral upside down as far as we are concerned. Our view of morality is basically that policy is moral if it advances certain basic principles and rights, something that we mentioned to you in a letter that we sent about 200 years ago, and which says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When I have the privilege of visiting our forces in various parts of the world, I'm struck, first of all, by their enormous morale in which they feel they are doing something worthwhile, not just for themselves, but for others. Mostly that's because the others in the areas where they serve have made them feel enormously welcome. I particularly noted an example at the Fulda Gap, which divides East and West Germany, as you know. And here our observation towers face east because it is essential, we feel, that we be apprised of any kind of movement toward the line that would indicate an interference with the basic mission that not just the United States, but which NATO has, of trying to protect the freedoms of the people in West Germany. But the observation towers on the other side face east too. And they face east for a very different reason. They face east to contain and keep in and prevent anyone coming to the West. I think it's a highly moral act when we emerged from World War II with total and complete military supremacy and with a monopoly of the nuclear weapons. And we did not use this to blackmail the world. We did not use this to secure domination. Instead, we proposed through the Baruch Plan to offer this system of nuclear weapons to the world in order that it could be dismantled. And we offered to ensure that we would not only give up these nuclear weapons, but then when that was not accepted, what we did was then to try to help rebuild the economies of our allies and our former enemies. Not a morality which touched on whether or not it helped the United States. Not a morality touched on whether or not it advanced the cause of communism, but a morality based on what we thought was the right thing to do in helping to advance the basic principles under which our country was founded. Now, who among the Soviets voted that they should invade Afghanistan? Maybe one, maybe 5 men in the Kremlin. Who has the ability to change that and bring them home? Maybe one, maybe.
All right, I don't want to stopping this, but seems like the obvious 1984 response, although maybe in 1984, I'm not 100% of the timeline here, it wasn't widely known, would be, okay, when was the big American vote about, whether to intervene in Nicaragua and, fund the Contras?
He gets to that, and you should play it forward. It's actually pretty damning.
5 men in the Kremlin, nobody else. And that is, I think, the height of immorality, because it means that no matter what faint glimmerings of public opinion may sometimes stir in the Soviet Union, as they have stirred rather vigorously in Poland, would be not tolerated, would be stamped out, and that would be not only the end of the glimmerings, but the end of the people who raised it. So the ability of the people, yes. Mm-hmm.
So you have rightly condemned the puppet state's controls by the Soviet Union. But is it not true that your country also controls in, for example, the whole of Latin America, many corrupt and puppet governments? And surely the question we are asking you to address yourself tonight to all is, what is the difference, if any, and I suspect there is no difference, as do many, many people in this country, what is the difference between your puppet regimes and the puppet regimes of the Soviet Union?
Good question.
The difference is very clear. American support of any regime, puppet or otherwise, can be changed and can be changed overnight by the vote of our Congress, by the vote of our people, and whatever support was given to whatever regime must cease. And that cannot be done in the Soviet Union. It is important to to bear in mind that whether or not you do have agreement with our course in Latin America, and bear in mind that what we are seeking in Central America is enormous economic assistance that can enable those countries to rid themselves of the terrible poverty that has made them such an inviting target for communism of the Libyan and Cuban character, that it is essential to give the people an opportunity to exercise their own judgment and their own will. But if our people disapprove of it, if our people think that we are making the error that you think we are making, something can be done about it. And that cannot be done in the Soviet Union. That, I think, is a significant difference in morality. The ability of people to participate in and control their own government and their own foreign policy is, I think, the highest form of morality. Yes, sir.
Please excuse me for intervention. Do you think that an immoral act becomes less immoral because we have the choice to do it or not? And do the people... And do the people who are tortured and killed and terrorized by those regimes think it is a more moral act because Congress approves of it and not some general?
The point is that whether you think it is moral or not, or whether anyone else thinks it is moral or not, it is capable of being stopped and changed by the will of the people. And that cannot be done in the Soviet Union. You have locked in acts which may or may not be considered to be immoral by others, but nothing can be done about them. And in our country and under our system, it is possible to make those changes. I'd like to discuss just a moment here a couple of the things that, I'll give way in just a moment, a couple of the things that Mr. Thompson raised. He said that we aren't really discussing how it would be for people to live in the Soviet Union, and we aren't really discussing internal conditions in the Soviet Union. It seems to me we are. We have to be, because it is those conditions which give rise to a foreign policy and give rise to the ability to judge the moralities of that policy. There are some of the ways you judge it, and if it cannot be changed, it cannot possibly be considered moral. Deterrence, he said, in the United States, as I gathered it, with some kind of substantial criticism, is a dynamic concept and keeps changing. Indeed, it has to, because deterrence is a very difficult equation by which we try to get inside the Soviet mind and find out what it is would deter the Soviet Union from making an attack. Now, sir, you had a question.
Perhaps I will still make the point, despite the fact that it's rather old now. You talked about the American people having a choice. The American people having the choice that if they didn't like the foreign policy of your government, they could do something about it, they could put you out of office. That assumes, sir, that they know what's going on. That assumes, in the case of Nixon and Vietnam, that they knew how many people were dying. That assumes that they knew the reasons for the Americans being in Vietnam and they knew what was going on. They didn't, sir, and your system perhaps is based upon deceit as much as it is anything else.
But on the contrary, they did know what was going on. They did put an end to it. And they put an end to it precisely when it was concluded by the majority of the American people that this was an enterprise in which they felt they should no longer engage, and they did end it, and they ended it very quickly. Why have the cruise missiles come to Britain? Why have the Pershings come to Germany? For a very good reason. Because the NATO organization to which we all belong unanimously asked to have them in 1979 and repeated it time after time after time. I've gone to, I guess, 4 meetings of NATO a year, and there is never a time during the 3 years that I've been attending those meetings that there hasn't been an effort made to cancel, change, revise, amend, repeal, in some way, end the 1979 dual-track resolution, and they all failed. 3 countries where the missiles are to be deployed or are being deployed have voted on this within the last year. Britain, Germany, and Italy. So I think what we're talking about here, and Mr. Thompson again said in his very eloquent talk, what is this quarrel all about? It's really very simple. The quarrel is all about freedom, individual, human, personal freedom, and whether or not we are to be allowed to exercise it, our children, our descendants for many generations, as you and I have for all of our lives, or whether or not that's to be blocked by the imposition of a system that without any deterrence, without any troops, without any military preparations, would hardly be much interested in respecting a proposal that the fractured part of Europe, East and West, come together, draw into itself, and ask, please, to be let alone from nuclear weapons. That's what it's all about. It's about personal freedom. And I rest my case on your liberty to walk out either door, not have anything happen thereafter, have no intimidation, no threats, no arrests. And I ask you to consider whether in the other system, you and your families could have been here, or if you felt it was safe to your family to come here tonight and express the things on either side, the things I'm saying, the things Mr. Thompson has said so eloquently, or many others, if you think that was if that is a system. So I urge your opposition to this motion so that you can come again.
Secretary Weinberger's speech has ended. Quiet, good-humored, and evidently well-received speech from the Oxford Union. Nicholas O'Shaughnessy, the speakers have left. The next act is the voting, I take it.
Yes, it is. Yes.
And the voting is done how?
Well, you will notice that as each student goes through the door, they actually go through one side of the door or the other, and in that act they vote.
Given the fact that Secretary Weinberger did come to the Oxford Union, and that there was a school of thought that he would be eaten alive by E.P. Thompson, how do you think he made out?
I think he was, to some extent, thrown out of gear by those interruptions, but generally speaking, it was a fairly good performance and one which I think won a certain amount of respect here in this House tonight.
I like the announcers, it's like they're
to the throne to
commentating on a fancy dog show.
There being 232 votes in favor of the motion and 271 votes against the motion and 3 abstentions, I declare the motion to have been defeated.
All right, well, there you go. The British aristocracy voted, and it turned out that the United States was morally superior to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's been settled for all time.
Yeah, that is, I gotta say, like the weirdest thing about Oxford and Oxford-style debates is the voting that, like, it just seems to be based on an unrealistic model of how persuasion works. That like that second, that you hear an argument for a position that that you weren't initially inclined to agree with, if it's a good argument, you'll just immediately have this like Paul on the road to Damascus moment. I think more realistically, certainly thinking back to all the times in my life that I've changed my mind about something, it's a much slower and more painful process than that. But,
yeah, I remember running into a classmate of mine from grad school at Berkeley, and when we were there together, we had an argument about how difficult it was for women in the department, and she said that there was a fair amount of sexism, that it affected people's careers. I argued against that. I'm kind of like, these are your professors, my professors. We know them. How could you think this about these people? And I saw her again. It was like 5 or 6 years later at an APSA meeting, and we got to talking. And I'm like, you were right about that. I changed my mind. You were right. I'm sorry. And she said, it took you 5 years to figure that out. I'm like, no. It took me 1 year to figure that out, and it took me 4 more years to admit I was wrong.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I guess like so on the substance, I mean, what Casper Weinberger did, was, I guess, exactly what you'd expect him to do, which is to focus relentlessly not on what the United States does or was doing or had done, in other countries,
get the foreign policy out of their foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly. Was basically to say that I guess it's a different version of that same kind of Protestant view you talked about earlier, that the United States foreign policy was morally superior, not because the actual specific foreign policy decisions were morally superior, but because they emerged from a morally superior process.
Yeah, and there's something I find it fascinating that he thought that this was okay to say that, if we're murdering people in El Salvador, we can stop if Americans decide that they don't want to do that anymore. And it's like, well, what about the Salvadorans, right? Like, what about the Vietnamese? There's this kind of bizarre, and I get it. It's not exclusive to the United States.
Sure.
Jacobins had the same delusions about democracy and the public, the general will, that you'll get right conclusions from the deliberations of a free people.
Right.
But that exclusivity, right? That there's I think he must have been speaking through the TV to an American audience. That's who he was trying to reach, because it's empowering to hear that you can, if you want, change American policy with your vote, and we have to listen to you. But it is damning, especially to the people who are suffering under American foreign policy, to know that the Americans could stop this if they cared and if they wanted to. So what kind of monsters must they be?
Yeah, right, exactly. And I mean, it's really strange too, because I mean, the idea that you're gonna, that there's any necessary relationship between those things is, I mean,
Hitler was elected. I hate to say it, but
yeah. At least, right, came to, got enough votes to, for the coalition, blah, 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 right, but like, yeah.
Within the system, he was elected.
Yeah, right. That's right. He came to power through a democratic system. He, I made in the, in the Roman Republic, was actually much more true than in the modern United States, that citizens, had the ability to change, foreign policy decision, and that if there had been a mass decision by Roman citizens any given year that actually we should leave the Gauls alone, they actually would have been able within that year to do something about it, get rid of the consuls who voted the popular assemblies to stop the war.
I mean, we have the Melian dialogue, right? Like, please don't kill us all and sell our women and children into slavery. And then you've got these Greeks being like, but we want to.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one thing. I mean, that, like, even if it were completely true that the American public had this level of control that Weinberger has suggested over American foreign policy,
which it's not. I mean,
which it's not all true.
Yeah.
I mean, like, even if it were true, it would be a weird defense for all the reasons we've been saying. But also, it's crazily untrue. You say this in 1984, like several decades deep into the imperial presidency, the sort of massive extension of executive power over foreign policy, having a stand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
America hadn't declared war, despite being continually at war since World War II.
Right. Yeah. When at the time the
Congress is supposed to authorize all that stuff, but
right.
It turns out that it's a bother.
Yeah, and I mean, like, and it's crazy actually thinking about the fact that World War II was a declared war, and none of the stuff since was it? Because if there was ever an excuse for not going through the process, it would have been, hey,
Pearl
we've
Harbor,
literally been
yeah.
attacked, like we're just going to do this, without doing it. But at the time, it's like, well, no, obviously you can't go to war without Congress. So, you have to get them to real quick do a declaration of war. Whereas the idea that there was anything like that urgency with Korea, Vietnam, Iraq.
Yeah. and I could just imagine if there were Pearl Harbor today, the Kirsten Sinema would be like, I'm sorry, but I can't vote to fight back until you scale back that irresponsible spending on socialism. So.
Yeah, right. Would demand that the New Deal programs all be reversed, before the declaration of war could go through.
Yeah, I told the president what I'm willing to do.
Yeah, she's such an amazing figure, and all the more so because she dresses weird, and she was in the Green Party, and she's she feels like somebody that I could have run into at an activist meeting in 2004 or something.
She's hateable, relatable.
Exactly. All right, well, Kuba, thank you so much. Actually, no, sorry. Last point about the substance before we do that, because I think I just realized that I, had said this and sort of said it earlier, but we should really, really say this. Literally at the time that Casper Weinberger is saying American foreign policy is morally superior because the American people get to decide, he was the Secretary of Defense in an administration that was conducting a secret foreign policy behind the backs of Congress.
Yeah, and Iran-Contra, it's not just Central America, although Central America is dispositive. But in that administration, under those conditions, the equivalency of the Soviet Politburo to the American Oliver North, Casper Weinberger conspiracy of American hawks is the most acute. But this is a propaganda pose, because that's what he's engaging in. That continued to be effective for another 20, 30 years. And it ran out of steam basically when Obama didn't end the war on terror, didn't even shut down Guantanamo Bay, because at that moment, it stops being Bush is bad, but America works, and Americans will eventually do the right thing, to being oh no, this is how it is now.
Yeah, I mean, also really worth noting that when he said the word Vietnam ended the second the American people decide to end it, it's well, I mean, okay,
that's laughable.
Both LBJ and Nixon ran and were elected as peace candidates.
Yeah, and that's part of the genius of right-wing debaters, and especially in the pose and presentation of somebody like Casper Weinberger. They sound very reasonable. They sound very measured in the language that they use. There's no flourishes. There's no denunciations. But they just lie.
Yeah. And of course, obviously now, I mean, if anything, God, I mean, it rings even more, more hollow. The time that the United States was in Afghanistan was almost twice the length from the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to the last helicopter leaving Vietnam. And that thing was,
and twice as long as the Soviets were in Afghanistan too. Yeah. It takes the Politburo half as long to realize they've made a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, God, I mean, Joe Biden is certainly not anything that anybody could ever mistake for a principled anti-imperialist, but at least he does seem to have a track record of being willing to sort of decide that things were so disastrous that they weren't really, were no longer really in the empire's self-interest, like you're talking about the decision about not going further into Syria, earlier. But yeah, I mean, if that had been up for a popular vote, sure, 2001 we might have still invaded, but we certainly would not have still been in Afghanistan in like 2015.
Yeah, no, and Obama was supposed to sort this stuff out, right? He got a Nobel Peace Prize for showing up precisely in the hopes that he would sort this stuff out, and he didn't even close Guantanamo.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thank you, Kuba. This was a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Yeah. All right. Until next time.
Next time.